is a meeting of the Land Use Committee of the Wilmette Village Board, sitting as a special zoning committee. Eric, would you please call the roll? Or Mike, would you call the roll?
I apologize.
Oh, no, all good.
I should get myself off mute. Trustee Plunkett,
Here.
Trustee Dodd,
Here.
and Trustee Barrow.
Here, so I see that we're all here, so we obviously have a quorum. This meeting is being conducted remotely via Microsoft Teams software. The state of Illinois is still under portions of an emergency order, which was issued by Governor Pritzker as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, and as a result, and all in-person meetings of the village have been canceled. The state has amended the Open Meetings Act to permit electronic meetings, and we are conducting our business in compliance with state law and the Open Meetings Act. This meeting is being broadcast live on local channel 6 and at the village's YouTube page. A recording of the meeting will be archived on the village's website. A remote meeting requires a different mechanic for public participation, so to ensure that our residents and other interested parties have an opportunity to participate in the meeting, we have solicited public comment via email. So if you sent an email to publiccomment@wilmette.com at least 2 hours prior to the start of this meeting, our staff has shared your comment with members of the committee. If your comment was received within 2 hours of the meeting, it will be included in the meeting minutes. Members of the public watching via YouTube Live wishing to comment during the designated public comment period may submit comments through the chat feature on YouTube Live, and a member of the village staff will read your comment. For those who have connected via Microsoft Teams or telephone and wish to address the committee, I will ask people to speak up when it's time for public comment. Due to logistics, I will first ask someone to identify themselves if they would like to address the committee. We'll then assemble the list and we'll call on the individual person by person. For people who choose to speak, I would remind you that you have 3 minutes. Comments from the public, no matter how they are received, will be recorded into the meeting minutes as we typically do. With our meeting introductions incomplete, I'll move to item 3 on our agenda and seek a motion from the committee to approve the minutes of the Land Use Committee meeting of December 1st, 2020. May I have a motion?
So moved.
And a second?
Second.
The motion has been made and seconded. Eric, would you please call the roll on the motion to approve the minutes?
Trustee Plunkett,
Aye.
Trustee Dodd,
Aye.
and Trustee Barrow.
Aye. The minutes having been approved, the next item on our agenda is a review of amendments to the zoning ordinance to determine the appropriate zoning districts and other regulations for cannabis business establishments and medicinal cannabis dispensaries. Earlier this month, the village board met and referred this matter to the Land Use Committee for further study. This will be the first of many Land Use Committee meetings on this topic. And in addition to taking public comment later this evening, our next meeting will also be a public hearing when we will again solicit feedback from the community. I want to be very clear that this committee is not making a recommendation in regard to whether or not the village should submit the retail sale of adult use cannabis in Wilmette. Instead, our task is to review potential locations and related regulations for a cannabis dispensary and to submit a report to the village board to provide needed context for review by all 7 members of the village board and to enable them to make an informed decision on this matter. With that introduction, I'll turn the meeting over to Village Manager Mike Brayman for a presentation from our staff.
All right, thank you, Trustee Barrow. I'm going to share my screen here, and please, at any time, please stop me or slow me down, as some of these slides appear repetitive, so we'll move through some of them fairly quick, but just jump in if there's any questions or we need any further discussion. So I'm going to share this. Should have the PowerPoint on the screen, correct?
Mm-hmm.
All right. So the village board has been very methodical in its review of whether or not to permit recreational cannabis. And this slide here just shows our process to date. We had most recently met on February 4th, where this matter was referred to the Land Use Committee, sitting as a special zoning committee for further discussion. And as Trustee Barrow indicated, the purpose of the Land Use Committee's discussions tonight and in the future are really to provide context to the village board, as all 7 members of the board will meet again and deliberate and discuss whether or not to permit the retail sale of recreational cannabis. So this committee will not be making any specific recommendations as to a yes or no on that matter. As we've been methodical leading up to this point, we're going to continue to be methodical. So as Trustee Barrow indicated, this is the first meeting. At our next meeting, that date is to be determined. It is likely going to be late in March and actually more likely in April. As we look to avoid spring break, we want to make sure that all of our residents have an opportunity to participate and comment if they so choose. So we'll make sure as we move through this process with the committee that we're getting the word out as best we can. And as for that next meeting, and we'll discuss that at the end of our meeting tonight, we want to make sure we notify as many stakeholders as possible in the areas that we're going to really focus on. So bringing us back to tonight's meeting, the purpose of tonight is to identify zoning districts where we do not believe we should not permit dispensaries. So the focus tonight is not discussing, where we may think it makes sense or where we may want them, but where we do not think we want them. And we would eliminate those from our consideration, allowing us to focus at our second meeting on those sites that we think may be more appropriate. And then lastly, it may be as late as April when this matter gets back to the village board. We'll take our time on this. We'll make sure the committee's comfortable, has all the information that they need to make an informed report. So when we were preparing for this meeting, and we talked about this with the board on February 4th, we were grappling with how best to look at this from a zoning perspective and looking at locations. And at our February 4th meeting, we had kind of focused on the locations that we thought, and based on our discussions with industry reps for cannabis, thought made sense for a successful dispensary. However, after that board discussion on February 4th, the staff took a step back, thought about it some more, and we really felt like the best approach wasn't to look at what made sense for a dispensary as a business entity, but what makes sense for us as a community from a land use perspective. So to help us really understand that and provide context, we looked at 4 operating dispensaries close by in our area and really reviewed kind of the factors or the criteria that those communities seem to identify in locating those dispensaries. So we've really focused in on Skokie and Northbrook. Those 2 sites are standalone facilities. It's unlikely that our community would have a standalone facility based on how we're built out, but it's possible. And then Arlington Heights and Buffalo Grove are more infill locations in strip malls. The Arlington Heights one is in a strip mall with a Jewel. The Buffalo Grove one is in a strip mall with a Starbucks, a Mod Pizza, and a T-Mobile. So when we looked at the
question.
Yes.
Sorry, since we're on that, and I apologize, I probably forgot to ask this sooner. Do we know the square footage of all of those locations?
We know the first 3. I don't believe we know Buffalo Groves, but we can find out. Arlington Heights, as I recall from our previous materials, and Eric can double check those as we're going, was about 4,400 square feet. I think the Skokie and Northbrook stores, I think one of them was 10,000 and one maybe slightly under. The Buffalo Grove is a smaller store. So it would be more in line with the Arlington Heights one, but we can get that information.
Thank you.
So I have another question on this slide. So obviously you looked at these 4 locations, but like thinking about Skokie and Northbrook, I mean, those are in, like you said, standalone locations, and we just don't have that kind of space in our community to, and so I'm wondering, if you guys looked at other locations that, you know, I don't know, other communities that have recently, implemented. They don't have one in their community yet, but they just approved it. And I guess I'm just kind of wondering about these 4 locations that we looked at, just for more clarity's sake, because it doesn't feel like those locations where they currently have them are anything we have in our community. Let me say that. We don't have a lot of strip malls. We have one.
Well, I think most of our business areas are nice strip malls. And John Adler can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think, you know, if we were to look at an Edens Plaza or a Westlake Plaza, you know, that's that's somewhat similar to what you have in the Buffalo Grove one. You know, we looked at Evanston. That's in an urban setting adjacent to a Big Ten university. We didn't think that was all comparable. Highland Park is in an industrial setting. We don't have an industrial setting. I think when I go to this next slide here, you know, I think that'll help. We can come back to the communities. But, you know, when we looked at all 4 of those, they all had the same factors at play here. So whether or not we have a standalone facility or not, or we have the space for that, we found these 4 commonalities in all of those. And then Trustee Dodd, whether or not that's the case in other communities that have zoned for it but don't have dispensaries, we can look into that. I think that'd be very hard to really pin down, because somewhere like Park Ridge has zoned it in a pretty broad area. So without some more specifics on where exactly they may go, we may struggle with that. But we can have that discussion on looking at more communities. But it was very clear in reviewing those 4, none of them were at all adjacent or nearby to residential properties. That just was not something we found. And that is the case too in Highland Park, where it's in an industrial setting, and there's of course no residential nearby there. From a traffic perspective, they were all on major thoroughfares, not necessarily highways, but, you know, 4-lane roads, you know, 2 lanes in each direction. And really, the point that we took from that was they were really avoiding impacts on residential neighborhoods and residential streets when somebody from out of the community was coming to access the facility. They all had sufficient off-street parking. We know that's not necessarily the case here for a lot of our business districts, and that can be problematic. And none of them were in close proximity to a school. And we used, for our consideration, our school walking routes. So those 4 factors were pretty clear across the board where those other municipalities decided it was appropriate to zone for a dispensary. And as we get through each district tonight.
Can I just jump in here? I mean, I think apart from the 4 locations that you identified, if you didn't look at any of those locations and you just in the abstract thought about, well, what are the factors we ought to be thinking about? I think you would come to these 4 and perhaps other, but certainly these 4 factors. So I think this is a very grounded way to begin, regardless of the similarity or not of other locations, because these are things that ought to be important, and I think are important to everyone that lives in Wilmette, that each of these factors be satisfied.
Is that what we're saying, that each of these, I mean, and the reason why I'm asking the question, and I'm not saying whether I do or do not agree with these factors, Peter, I'm just saying that we don't have a lot of properties that actually meet these factors, you know, because of our community, because of just the way our, you know, we've got a stable community that's been developed, you know, and so if a location meets 3 out of the 4 of these factors, do we feel that that's still up for discussion? I guess that's what I'm.
you know, we might, at the end of the day, we might say, right, it's close. It's not 100%, but it's close enough. But these certainly are all things, all boxes that we ought to be thinking about checking, because they're all things that impact, you know, quality of life and the people that live here.
Yeah, and what I want you to know is that in my discussions with residents, they've suggested sites that don't meet all 4 of these criteria. And that's why I was asking.
Yeah,
Okay.
that may not be a surprise. I've heard, I would actually agree with that. I've had conversations with folks that have suggested one place or another place, and we'll get to some of those places. Those folks that have suggested that are also folks that don't live near those locations.
That's not necessarily true. Just
Yeah, well,
not
just in the
to be
conversation.
challenging, but
Yeah.
not at least in my situation.
Mhm.
In my situation, these are people that live near these locations.
Well, any case, I think these are things that we really need to drill down on, because they really do affect, you know, the quality of people's lives that might be proximate to a cannabis location.
I'm going to throw in a question here too, because we had to zone an area for medical cannabis. And, you know, obviously we don't have a medical cannabis retailer here, but is that going to factor at all into our conversation? Would we change that zoning based upon our discussions here? Or are all future medical cannabis retailers kind of going along the way of offering both in the future?
So I'll jump in a little bit here. When the initial licenses went out, most medical cannabis retailers converted into what was called preliminary license, converted into a recreational business. That's not saying every single one of them. There's actually one in Evanston that's pretty close to Wilmette that is right now just medical. But most of them are for the obvious reasons of the clientele and the customer base increases significantly with recreational. I think most places are not looking for a medical facility standalone anymore. And back to your original comment is that we had to zone it. That is correct. We had to, by law, provide a specific zoning district for medical cannabis retailers. We do not have to do so for this adult use. I don't know if that factors in or not, but that is just something that's just to be aware of.
But we've zoned that on, isn't that on Green Bay?
The dispensaries on Green Bay and the cultivation center, which would obviously never come here, there's not enough room, is in that industrial area, quote unquote industrial area off a lake.
Okay.
Okay, so wait, Jeff, so where do we, not that we have any, but where do we allow medical dispensaries in the community?
Basically in the south, it'll be the south corner, the south part of Green Bay Road. So
the south part.
I'm thinking like
What
Firefly
part,
and
like Wilmette Avenue to the south?
I think it's even farther south. John knows the specifics.
It's Linden south, so the Jewel in south.
The Jewel in south.
Yeah.
And was that, was that a board decision? I'm sure it was. I just don't.
It was.
Yep.
And how did we select that location? Sorry, just for some background. I just want to remember.
I think there was a desire to have it be a relatively small area with fairly good traffic with, Green Bay Road and the ability to handle traffic. I also, at the time, I think, the idea of having it closer to the southern border where there were already dispensaries in Evanston. And at that time, I think we were fairly confident that people weren't looking in Wilmette for the medical dispensary. And, ultimately this was that was the best location.
And so we don't allow it in Eden's Plaza?
No, the only location for medical is that GC1 district, and the only GC1 district is Linden South on Green Bay Road.
John, one sort of follow-up on the medical. Have we ever been approached by any one desiring to open a medical facility here?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Very, very rare, or very unlikely that they would consider. The medical licenses are significantly more regulated and limited. They were more regulated and limited at that time prior to the adult use. There was only 60 for the entire state, and they were broken down by region. And once one came into this region, which was Evanston and Highland Park, I don't believe there's any more licenses in that region. So unlike adult use, it was a very limited and very dispersed licensing program from the state.
And Mr. Stein reminded me, the reason why GC1, this area, was also selected is there were very few, of any, locations that met the distancing requirement from schools and daycares. And this really was one area where you could get that 1,000, I think it was either 1,000 or 2,500 feet from a school or daycare. And so it was, you weren't going to find it in the village center. You weren't going to find it, there's a lot of places you weren't going to find it. You weren't going to find it at Eden's Plaza. You weren't going to find it along Skokie Boulevard. So I think that was the other reason.
So, and just background on that is that those distances are no longer, they've been repealed by the state, but they were mandated for medical. But once the adult use passed, any medical cannabis or adult use cannabis no longer has to abide by those by state law. Of course, we can impose our own.
All right, so I'll keep moving through the presentation and we'll slow and stop as we have additional discussions. Trustee Plunkett, to answer your question, Eric did look it up. The Skokie site is 15,000 square feet. Northbrook is 9,000 and Arlington Heights is about 4,400. So we'll get an answer for the committee on Buffalo Grove, but it's certainly more on the Arlington Heights size than the other two. So this just lists our commercial zoning districts. It's a cover slide for the rest of our discussion here. And as we go through this, keep in mind that as we were reviewing the criteria and checking the box or not checking the box, some of this is subjective. So, we expect the committee to potentially, disagree with our analysis, and that makes sense. We had our own internal deliberations and discussions because not all of it is clear cut. So this is going to be a really helpful discussion for the board to really flush all this out and make sure we fully understand what we're looking at in each zoning district. But this map here just shows you where each of the districts are and helps to orient the committee and our viewers. These blue districts here, these are all of our neighborhood retail districts. I think the definition of that district is very informative as we're making our decisions here, and we'll discuss that. And then obviously we have Eden's Plaza over here, our industrial area. This is our public works yard. And we'll talk about each one of these in greater detail. So just as an introduction to each district, we just wanted to lay out what the recommendations are based on this criteria. We are not recommending it in a number of districts, and we'll get into those in greater detail. We do recommend, if we're going to permit recreational dispensaries, that Eden's Plaza did check all the boxes in terms of resident impact, traffic, parking, and schools. So we do have multiple neighborhood retail districts, as we saw on that map. So we have a slide here for each one, and I think it's helpful to look at the overhead and understand what is kind of a part of that district or what's adjacent to it. So you'll see here, this is neighborhood retail. And John, do you have the definition of neighborhood retail handy that you could just read the first couple sentences? I think that really informs why we don't recommend it at all in neighborhood retail. Yeah,
the purpose of the NR district is established to promote the the continuation of existing commercial centers that provide goods and services primarily for the convenience of the residents of the surrounding neighborhood.
So when we read that, and that's the definition of the zoning code, that was to us very clear that, a cannabis dispensary, that's a destination dispensary. That's pulling in folks from out of town and all across the region. That doesn't really meet what a neighborhood retail district is intended to be. And you can see here with the overhead, we have a number of residential properties directly adjacent behind or to the south here, and we did not think it met that criteria.
And an excellent example of that is the Treasure Island site.
Yes, and that's this slide here, and that's a logical site to a lot of residents, right? Well, we have a large vacant space, we can revitalize it there, but that retail district is for that neighborhood, and you can see the residential properties all right here and all right here. You've got the St. Joseph School here. I know that's just kindergarten now. That could change again in the future. So there, 2 of the 4 boxes are not checked, and we did not feel we could make that recommendation to locate it here. Ridge Road and Wilmette Avenue. This is where the new artist structure is now. This is where the Shell gas station is. Once again, neighborhood retail. You've got residential properties right here. You've got residential properties here that are multifamily, and again here. So those residential properties really surround this district, and no matter where a dispensary could go here, they would be adjacent to residential. Skokie Boulevard and Old Glenview Road. And this is the former Baker Square site right here. This is Wilmette Commons. None of these meet the residential threshold, as you'll see all these properties. Mather Place is actually considered a residential property as well. And Wilmette Commons actually doesn't meet the current state law that prohibits dispensaries from being within 1,500 feet of one another. Just off the map down here is that very, very large facility in Skokie. And then the Skokie and Wilmette intersection, once again, surrounded by residential properties. It's also on, this is a school walking route right here, and we have a crossing guard at this intersection. Still in the neighborhood retail. So this is Lake Avenue. John, correct me if I'm wrong. This is where our Jimmy John's and the Starbucks is right up here. These are residential homes directly behind it. While not a formal school walking route, we of course have a lot of Loyola students who will park somewhere in these neighborhoods and walk to the school. We also have students from this neighborhood walking to Avoca School down here in Glenview. So we didn't feel it met either one of these 2 criteria. This is also a residential structure right here. It's a multifamily building. So that's it for neighborhood retail. Now we have Linden Square, which is actually also a type of neighborhood retail district. And in our minds, another one where it would seem logical where we could put a dispensary, revitalize an area, help to bring it back to life like that Treasure Island site. But if you look at the overhead here, the entire district is surrounded by residential properties. It's in the middle of a neighborhood, which is why it doesn't meet our traffic criteria. So if somebody's coming from out of town, they've got to drive through a number of residential streets to access the site, unless, of course, they're coming from the CTA. General commercial districts, I think this is what we were discussing and referring to regarding the medicinal dispensary location, correct, John?
Yes.
This is Green Bay Road, south of Linden. And clearly here you'll see we have all these I'm sorry, I went the wrong way there. We have all these residential properties that back to it. Parking could or could not be an issue depending on the site located, which that's always something that can be handled through a special use permit. But it is adjacent to residential. That's just not something we saw anywhere else or we were necessarily comfortable recommending. GC2, this is heavy commercial. So right here, this is Lake Avenue. This is the Wilmette Park District Golf Course. Right here is, that's the stone and gravel facility that I can't remember the name of the operation. I'm blanking on it, John, if you have it. It'll come to us. And then up here, we have a storage facility. So there are sites in here where it may work from a residential perspective if you look up here adjacent to the golf course, but that's pretty inaccessible, and I'm not sure many businesses are going to want to be located that far from Lake Avenue. Now down here, there are residential properties right next to this stone and gravel facility, and in our deliberations internally among staff, you know, the discussion was, well, it doesn't meet our residential criteria. These residents may see a dispensary as a less intrusive use than the current construction activity that they're seeing here. The same here, there's a lot of construction activity, dust and debris up over here. So it doesn't necessarily meet our criteria and we're not recommending it, but it's an area that, you know, we could study further. We could bring some of those stakeholders in for further discussion, but we also don't see it necessarily as the best location either. I think there's more logical locations as we'll move through this.
Can you just, but that location is the only one that might have a possibility of a standalone, correct?
Yeah, I think right down in here, that would probably be the one location for a standalone. And now as we get into Eden's Plaza, I don't think it's unrealistic, to think a standalone could be built in an outlot there too. So those are probably the two locations, Baker Square being the third potential standalone site. John, I don't know if you can think of any others off the top of your head, but those are probably the three most likely.
I mean, at the Plaza del Lago, there's a vacant piece of property currently on Sheridan Road that, I mean, theoretically.
And we can highlight that when we get to that slide.
And Lucas did remind me it is Skokie Valley Material and Hoffman Excavating there.
Thank you. I knew it was going to come to one of us.
Yeah, if you didn't, yeah.
Isn't that Baker Square site though, isn't that already ruled out because of its proximity to the one in Skokie?
I'm going to go back to that one for a second here. Did I go too far? I think I went too far. So Wilmette Commons is ruled out. Baker Square, I think when we were doing our measurements, would have been okay.
No, Baker Square is ruled out too.
That is ruled out too. Okay.
Yeah, everything in there falls within 1,500 feet of the greenhouse.
Thank you for that clarification.
Okay.
All right, so we're going to go back. Any other discussions on this district before we move to the next one?
I mean, without jumping to the desirability from the perspective of, is this a good place to locate a business? Having said that, I can't imagine a consumer-focused retail business that would want to be located in that GC2 district. I can't imagine what business would find that a desirable place to locate.
Yeah, it's a tough one, especially as you move up to the north. I think the only possible one obviously would be right along Lake Avenue. You'd have to get that frontage. GC2 also continues south of Lake Avenue. That includes our Public Works facility, which is right here, as well as a self-storage facility that is down here. Once again, it doesn't necessarily meet our residential criteria. There are homes all along here. Traffic, it's not Laramie Avenue is the only access point. So you have to drive past a number of homes on a residential street. And it doesn't necessarily have the parking. This, I guess, Trustee Dodd, to your question, this could be another standalone site on the self-storage property if someone were to buy it, demolish, and build a new structure. I would find that to be pretty unlikely, though. Village Center. So we've separated it out into east and west of Green Bay Road. So east of Green Bay Road, obviously we have residential properties all around, but we don't think about it a lot, but we have residential properties directly above many of our businesses downtown on Wilmette and Central Avenues. So it doesn't check the residential criteria checkbox. And obviously parking, we know, is an ongoing challenge in our downtown. While there is plenty of available public parking spaces, they're not necessarily as convenient as customers would like. And I don't necessarily see that changing if it's a dispensary as opposed to a restaurant or a retail store. West of Green Bay Road. So this is where the M&R development at 611 and 617 Green Bay Road is located. This is International Bank. Optima did close on that property earlier this week. So they now own that and are proceeding with their construction. So that would have been a site for a standalone, but that is spoken for at this point. So while it's site specific on the residential, that's pretty limited because you have all residential properties here. We again have residential properties here on Park and then back over here. So the only ones that really aren't impacted by residential are the directly fronting Green Bay Road, where you have these institutional uses like the library and the post office behind it. And parking, as we know on this block, is very site specific and can be difficult. Our office research district, one we don't talk about very much, but it's at Lake Avenue and Skokie Boulevard. So this is actually the Chalet Garden Center. This is the Chalet office building, and as you can see, they're all abutting residential properties right here. It does meet our other criteria from a traffic, parking, and schools standpoint. And then more office research district. This is the hotel right here, and then there is an office building behind it. And then these are right up here off of Old Glenview Road. These are very small one-story office spaces that are generally leased. And in our internal discussions, this, on its face seemed like a very logical location for a dispensary. But as we dug into the maps and the zoning, it really is all directly adjacent to residential here. We know there was a lot of concern from these residents when the hotel was constructed. So they're very attuned to what is located in these properties. And the access here is very difficult. So if you're coming from the north, you've got to drive through a one-lane road directly past residential homes through this street to get down to this access point, or you have to come up from, I'm blanking on is it Old Orchard Road down here? And up through the hotel, and it's a really roundabout way to get anywhere. And we know a lot of folks are going to end up in residential neighborhoods just trying to find what's in here. It's very difficult to access.
Mike, I just have a question. When you guys talked about kind of close to residential and stuff, what, it could be that of an entire piece of the particular zoning area, portions of it are near residential, but other portions are not. And so I'm just trying to understand, was it if any portion butted up to residential, or was there a certain, within, like, kind of like what you did with the Wilmette Commons and the Baker Square, 1,500 square feet or whatever? I'm just curious.
Sure.
And that's a question to all of them, not just this particular.
Yeah, that's a good question, because we did discuss that. So and this is where I'm going to make a mistake by getting into zoning. So John or Jeff, please jump in as soon as I mess it up. But we can have overlay districts within a zoning district where the cannabis dispensary would be restricted, let's say here, just to this area. So it's, you got the residential here, but you may be allowed to do it there. And I see Jeff popping on. Jeff, if you wanted to add anything.
Well, I think you're absolutely correct. So we could obviously rezone and make things an overlay district, which would be exactly the same it is today, but you add in that a dispensary can go there. But I think to answer your question directly is, you'll see where it says site specific, and you've seen it on other criteria that we've listed. That's when it comes to parking or residential, that there may be a site or two within that zoning district that would meet all 4 criteria. And I think that answers I think that was the question you were asking. Clearly, in this one right in front of us, every site is abutting residential, right? But
yes, right.
There was some in the, if Mike, you want to go back up to the east of or west of Green Bay Road, you see how it's site specific. So there are very limited sites in here that could meet all 4 criteria, and we would just do, like Mike said, an overlay district if that was.
That's kind of what I was asking. That's a good. I mean, yes.
Yeah.
Or if you went to
and if it's site specific, it means it's actually very limited, but we couldn't say for sure that every parcel in this was not going to meet our criteria.
Okay. And so so I have a further question on that, to be honest, just so I understand. So if you look at the Village Center District, you've got site specific, but if you go to if you go to Linden Square, for example, isn't there some site-specific locations there as well? That's what I mean, I see sites that don't butt up right against.
I think when we're talking about residential Linden Square, our opinion, we had that discussion too about Linden Square specifically, is it is smack dab in the middle of a residential neighborhood. So even if there's a site there that doesn't directly abut a residential property, it really is a neighborhood district that is not intended to be a destination for folks all across the region.
And actually, just taking a look at the map, though, there really isn't any sites where it wouldn't abut besides the CTA, and obviously we can't consider that.
Well, you've got this site. Okay. I mean,
these are all anything not highlighted is actually residential.
But there's okay.
There are a couple sites. There's on the corner. There's a site, but they're fairly small. The one might be the northeast corner of Linden and Fourth. I think that's probably what you're thinking about, Trustee Dodd, right there.
Yeah, or even on the other side there.
Right.
I mean, there are sites there. That's all I was saying. Yeah. And I think, okay.
And that's an area that not only is it residential, but it's really intensely residential because there are single family homes and there are condos. So it's more than a regular, a residential district that was simply single family homes. When you are in that area, it seems to me you are particularly aware of just the number of people that live there in both homes and condos and apartments.
I agree with you, Trustee Barrow, but it also is an area that's, as a commercial district, has really struggled, and the residents within that community are frustrated by that. And so I'm not saying that this is what they would want, but I'm not proposing this, I'm just a smaller boutique type of store that then would generate the other kinds of things to be into that district. I'm just not, I don't know if the residents would be interested in that. I think that's why we're here today. We don't know.
Right.
And so that's all I'm asking is, do we, if we felt like there was a one or two smaller sites, would, part of it is the market will help define to some degree what would work and wouldn't work, right? And so I just don't want us to be making all the decisions that the market will help us define. And it's a special use, and so that's why I was asking.
Yeah, no, I certainly agree that that's an area that development has struggled. Gosh, I feel as long as I've lived in Wilmette, and virtually anything that we can do to improve that is probably a good thing. But we need to know an awful lot more before we got to the point that we would think of that or any of these really as a good location.
And I think when staff was looking at this from a residential standpoint, we really looked at the referendum results too, right? 56% to 44%. And that was pretty consistent across the community. We had included that map in the board packet. So we were working for the assumption that 44% of residents in these areas are generally not going to be inclined to want it there anyway. And then you put it in the backyard, that number probably increases. So, we're trying to limit, residents, being uncomfortable with the discussion if it's unlikely that a dispensary would even locate there anyway. Right. So that was kind of we wanted to make sure we were setting clear expectations for the community. But that's why we're having this discussion tonight, because if we want to put, say, just as an example, Linden Square on the table, then we would do really hard work and notice efforts to make sure all the residents in that area were aware, so we can get a lot of good feedback at the next meeting to have a meatier discussion. And we can get through the rest of the districts and then kind of go through the list again and see if there's others we'd want to kind of put into that discussion for our next meeting.
Now, this is all focused on, what we want as a community, which obviously makes sense. But at what point do we say, we've talked to certain retailers and, they're not interested in any location, maybe but Eden's Plaza. When do we have that discussion, and when does that overlay into us pointing out some of these neighborhoods? Because we might say, oh, this neighborhood needs something, or maybe they're not, residents, would be okay with that. We don't know. But, if it's not going to be a desirable location, why are we going through that exercise? Or maybe, I don't know, maybe it could be a desirable location in 10 years and we need to talk about this now. But I'm just kind of wondering when we overlay that, because residents would probably want to know if their neighborhood is never likely to be used because nobody wants to set up shop there.
Sure. I think that's a really, really good point. And I know Jeff's had a lot of discussions with a cannabis industry rep in Illinois to help kind of with our thinking and understanding where these types of businesses want to go. And I know there's other folks out there who can have those conversations as well. I think, you know, if we start to wanting to look at additional districts outside of Eden's Plaza, I think before, maybe before we have that discussion with residents, you know, we maybe would have an interim meeting with some cannabis industry reps to see if that's even a logical place. Because to your point, Trustee Plunkett, you know, I don't think we want to upset a whole bunch of residents if it's really unlikely that they're going to locate, say, at the Linden Square District. And I think we know, we've talked about it on February 4th, you know, in our discussions and in Jeff's discussions, Eden's Plaza was really the most logical location because of its access to the highway, the traffic patterns, the parking. That was really the one place people keyed in on. I think we can talk a little bit more about Plaza del Lago. There's another larger center that has some downsides in our opinion, but for the most part, these smaller districts are just not going to be desirable based on what we're hearing. And unless we hear otherwise, I don't necessarily think we want to go around concerning a bunch of our residents if nothing's going to come of it.
Yeah, I second that, Mike. I do. And we're doing this at a time when Greenhouse has a 15,000 square foot facility that's you know, biking distance from a Wilmette, you know, border. So that anything that we'd have to be putting in would have to have market appeal in a way that Greenhouse doesn't. So I think it's really pretty critical that we understand what it is, the people that do this, what it is that they're looking for.
I'm going to go back to where we left off, and I think it was here. So we had talked about the hotel property and the residential adjacent. So the next one in the office research district is, believe it or not, the Park District property at the rec center. So that has to be zoned something. It's zoned office research. Obviously, it doesn't meet the residential component. We all know that. And it's also on a school walking route. So now we get into our planned commercial districts, Eden's Plaza, Westlake Plaza, and Plaza del Lago. So the first one here is Eden's Plaza. This is the large former Carson's box. This is where the pediatric medical facility and Great Escape is. We do believe this meets all of the criteria. Obviously, we have no residential on the highway. You have Westlake Plaza here to the south. You have the chalet and the office buildings here. The only bit of residential nearby are these homes right here, and that is buffered by multiple lanes as well as the fork as you head out to the highway here. There is additional residential properties up to the north as well. It does hit the traffic with Lake and Skokie Avenues being major thoroughfares. It has sufficient parking. And the schools, we did want to caveat the schools. Loyola, you can see a bit of the football field right here. So depending on how you measure it from lot line to lot line, it is within 300 feet across the expressway. We hope and assume nobody's crossing the expressway to get from Loyola to Eden's Plaza. So when you actually take the walking route across the ramps, it's 900 feet. So we felt comfortable that that met that criteria there.
Can I, just talking about Loyola, what about that Pace bus at Eden's Plaza? Doesn't that like pick up and drop off Loyola kids? And I don't know this for certain, but I mean, I thought there was some kind of transportation that involved Eden's Plaza with kids from Loyola.
We can check on that for the next meeting. And I think for the next discussion, if we agree Eden's Plaza is a site we want to dig into, I think we should invite Loyola reps to the meeting to get their feedback and their insight, and we can ask them that question directly as well. Plaza del Lago, this is an interesting site. It's another one that seems like a really logical location because it is a shopping center. You know, we felt pretty strongly that it didn't meet the residential criteria for a number of reasons. One, you have the Westerfield townhomes here, you have the residential properties here, but you also have the high-rise condominiums here. And worth noting with the high-rises, this was the precinct in town that was most opposed to permitting the recreational sale of cannabis in Wilmette. 57% of residents in this precinct, and this precinct is just these high-rises, it's not including any of these homes, was pretty ardently opposed. So while it may be a logical site from a parking, from traffic, Sheridan Road, we think comes close and does meet the traffic criteria, and it's not on a school walking route. We do think there are a lot of residents, especially across the street here, who would be potentially concerned. And if we have a better location, as Eden's Plaza may be, we don't necessarily think it's worth engaging that community when there is a more logical location for a dispensary. And Westlake Plaza, this is PCD 3. This is an interesting one. Another one I think that we can look at as pretty logical. Parking, as any of us who've ever shopped there know, is very, very difficult. Access, even though it's off of Lake Avenue and Skokie Boulevard, is not great either. But it does meet that threshold. The bank, this is the bank here. And the reason it says site specific on parking is the bank does have its own enclosed parking area that is not as difficult as the others. But really, if you look here, you've got these residential properties directly behind and right here as well. So it doesn't meet that criteria. And when we're looking at dispensaries, we're also looking at truck traffic, delivering the product, delivering and taking the cash, because it's a cash business. And that would be a more intensive use for these residents, because all the truck traffic does go, there's a little alleyway right here that goes through and around. And most of the uses the newer uses we see coming here are less intensive, more service type uses that don't have that type of truck traffic. So this is another location that I think is worthy of discussion, but again, doesn't necessarily check all the boxes like in Eden's Plaza does. And across the station here, the BP gas station is also in PCD 3. So this is just a duplication of our earlier slide summarizing our recommendations. As we noted, the one district that clearly met all of our criteria, or at least seems to, we need to dig into the Loyola discussion more, is Eden's Plaza. The others, for various reasons, we're not recommending. That doesn't necessarily mean they're not appropriate, or that we may not have looked at the criteria in the way that the board or the community will, but we think it's a good starting point for the committee's discussions.
Very good. Thank you, Mike. Are there any other questions or comments that any committee members want to raise at this point?
I want to ask about, so I did speak to an industry representative, and it sounded like Eden's Plaza was the only one, but there was like a smidgen of maybe a smaller location on Green Bay Road. Can we just look back at that slide? Because I'm not sure what you said about the site specific, or, I just kind of want to take a closer look at that one again.
All right, I'm going to pull that up here. So we have two Green Bay Road slides. The first is the neighborhood district north from Elmwood Avenue.
So Homer's, I don't think that was it. Yeah.
Okay, so it was the other one down to the south. So that's.
Yeah. So where you've got like the Office Depot, the piano store,
So, and this is the Jewel, right? So this is the Jewel in their parking lot, just to help orient ourselves. And then we move further down south here to our border at Isabella, where the Whole Foods is here across the street.
Okay, so, and in this, we were looking at maybe some site specific. And I mean, I'm not, I'm just bringing this up because it was the possibly maybe consider Green Bay Road, and I'm pretty sure it was in this location. Of all the sites, when I talked to this industry rep in Wilmette, it was, Eden's Plaza and possibly a smaller location here. So I don't know if we want to, discuss this anymore. I know it's surrounded by residential. I heard that, even bringing the Jewel in was a huge undertaking for residents there. So, I mean, this might just be dead in the water, but I thought as the only other possible one that this representative recommended, I wanted to talk about it for a minute.
And I would imagine, Sento, that he or she was thinking about a good place to locate a store in terms of visibility and maybe parking, but not in terms of the other criteria that we're thinking about tonight, proximity to residential. I can't imagine that was part of the thought.
No, I think this is not from a community perspective. It's where, it's from the other side, right? Where would a cannabis retailer think they could do well or make money? So I just, as this being the only other location that was brought up, I wanted to ask about it.
And although, we identify parking as site specific, it seems like parking is an issue in the entirety of this location. When I've gone to pretty much any store along here, if you have to park on Green Bay Road on either side, it's a challenge.
No, clearly, I think they would, although this representative said parking, while you need the parking, nobody parks for more than 5-10 minutes. It's usually a pickup and a drop off. So there's a high turnover. You need, according to him, you needed the parking, but the turnover was pretty quick. So you didn't need, long-term parking.
That's right. I mean, you don't consume the cannabis on the premises. So presumably you go there, you buy it, pick it up, get in your car and go wherever you're going.
Yeah, and from a parking perspective, the other thing to keep in mind are the number of employees. Obviously, in here it would be a smaller store, you'd have less employees. I drive by Greenhouse in Northbrook every day on my way home and to work. They have a lot of employees because it's a 9,000 square foot site. So they've got a very large parking lot that's fairly full, but not necessarily apples to apples for this area.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So I think the only other site I'd want to talk briefly about is Plaza del Lago. So I also spoke to somebody that has a lot of experience in the industry. This person actually lives in this right next to this area. So I forgot to share with him the results of the referendum because I had forgotten to talk to him about that. But this person just this is basically and he would be happy to come talk to us, but this is where he spent his last 3 or 4 years. And one of the things he said of why he believes that Plaza del Lago would be a good location for us to consider is because the data is showing that in lots of studies are showing this, but that the largest usage of adult use cannabis is actually in adults over 65. And the reason for that is because it provides a lot of pain relief. It provides sleeping relief. It provides stress. It just provides a lot of things that are common to what adults over age 65 start to struggles they have. And so they're the largest use of, at least from the data that they've seen. And so while I see that it butts up to this residential. That's why I was asking kind of about the residential. If it were further into if it were more of a, all of this is going to be the type of retail that's being requested. We're not, in some of these sites, it wouldn't be anything like the property on Old Orchard and Skokie. It could be a much smaller site. And so I guess I just wonder why we wouldn't consider that to study.
Just in terms of size, so we're going to be battling like reps that we've talked to, but the person that I spoke with said the smallest store that he could imagine as a boutique store is 5,000 square feet. Now, if this one in Arlington Heights is 4,400 square feet, that's obviously a little bit smaller. But I do think that there's a minimum size for all of their security and storage requirements. So that is something to consider, that, you know, we're not talking like a 2,000 square foot space. I think, you know, at a minimum, it's larger.
So can I ask John Adler a question on that? Just, so it's so John, I was looking a little bit today after you and I spoke. So when you were talking about what they have in Telluride, I mean, are those locations as large as 5,000 square feet? You said there were 5 within the downtown area of Telluride?
Yeah, I'm not certain the square footage. They're actually fairly large. A lot of areas is you don't see, they're behind the scenes. But I'm not sure how big they are. My guess is they're probably minimum 3,000 to 4,000 square feet.
Because that's what this person was telling me was a different size. That's why I was asking.
And do we have any sense of the vacancies in Plaza del Lago? Are there any stores of a sufficient size that where that might?
Lucas Sievertson.
Yeah. Sorry.
Good.
The size of spaces that are available at Plaza del Lago currently are around 2,000 square feet and under.
Like the Runner's Edge, for example, I believe that store is vacant. Was that about 2,000 square feet?
That's actually being occupied by a use called Stride. So they'll be soon occupied. But I'm trying to think of the biggest space that would be.
But don't we expect some development in that area as well? Hopefully, or no?
Within the shopping center, no new buildings are proposed. We would.
They were taken down some of that. Okay.
I mean, we would not be surprised if the property owner wished to redevelop some of the property, but at this time they haven't expressed any interest to us whatsoever.
Okay.
Well, in terms of moving the thinking about the plaza along, I really don't want to encourage more thinking about the plaza. Its proximity to the identified residential areas and the strong disinclination of the folks across the street make me think that this is something that we're probably jamming into an area where, by and large, the residents really don't desire it. And with that in mind, that's just not something that I want to do.
I'm gonna agree there. I think, and I think just in general, I think residents, you know, when we discuss any of these areas, I think they're probably gonna want to know, you know, what our criteria is, and does our criteria include local resident feedback? We obviously did the referendum, so we have a broad sense, but, you know, we can look at it on a close scale. I mean, surprisingly about the age group, I have no way of knowing otherwise. My only experience was, you know, parking myself outside the one in Arlington Heights for 20 minutes and having a long discussion with the security guard, and I don't think I saw anybody over the age of, like, you know, 34, 35 going in there, and it was fairly busy. But I obviously can't speak on that. But yeah, I mean, I wouldn't want to, well, that and the fact that, you know, I hadn't heard that this was a desirable location. Maybe Kathy, you had heard otherwise, but I don't know that this is a location that we need to continue speaking about.
I mean, the plaza has historically been considered one of the jewels of Wilmette. And maybe it's not what was, you know, when retail was stronger. I can remember talking with Joe Moss years ago when I was on the Plan Commission, and we were thinking about 4th and Linden, and we asked him to come in to talk about the plaza. And he spoke about how important it was to have the absolute correct mix of stores, and that he would rather have a store sit empty than put in a store that somehow would be perceived as dragging down the other existing retail stores that were there. Now, he doesn't own it anymore, and the retail world has changed. Nevertheless, it's an extraordinarily beautiful community shopping center. And unless there were a strong desire on the part of the adjacent residents, including the folks across the street, to accept that kind of a use, I just don't see any sense in, frankly, our committee spending a lot of time going down that road.
And I think too, we're, discussing our conditions now, and we're talking about the now, but I mean, who's to say that a future board in 5 or 10 years, maybe this cannabis will become as ubiquitous as a liquor store or a wine shop. We don't know. I mean, can always change. Where the conditions are now, I can't see being in favor of a location here.
And so I don't think, I don't agree with the two of you, and the reason why, but we can move on, is I don't see this as the time where we should be narrowing our focus. This is the time where we're just exploring. We're not making any decisions about any of these locations. We're just deciding whether we're even going to look at them. And so my point is, given that we've heard some feedback that this could potentially be a good site, I don't know why we wouldn't look at it. But that's how I look at this differently. Again, it's more about, we're not at the point where we're just beginning. That's what the whole discussion started. We're going to go through a very methodical process. We're going to get community engagement. We're going to seek feedback, and that's the process that we should and we will follow. And so my only point is, at this time, I don't see a need for us to be so singularly focused. That's all that I was trying to say, that we learn by being broader. We'll learn that for sure this isn't a location, or that we'll be able to refine even the reasons why we did or did not select a location. That's what I see as the benefit of looking at more than even one location, for that matter. But, this is, I'm in the minority here, and I'm sure, and so we can move on. But
no, Kathy, I don't disagree with that. I just don't see any, that's all true. I just don't see any benefit to our analysis by.
We don't even know that the largest, we're hearing hearsay, but we don't even know that there isn't a boutique store that that only needs 3,000 square feet. And there is a location in Plaza Lago. We're not even in that point yet. That's all I'm trying to say. We're not. So.
We've been talking about this for a long time. At what point would we be in that point, right? I don't see a lot of resident engagement in our discussions right now, probably because we haven't pinpointed a location, and then everyone realizes, oh my goodness, someone is discussing, putting this in my backyard. And I almost feel like until we get to that point, or until we get to the point where an actual retailer says, I want to locate here. But at that point, when they say, I want to locate here, are we so far down the road with them that, we would say, oh, sorry, we can't have you in this location. I worry, I don't know what they need. It's difficult to get a license from the state. It's difficult to choose this. This is not just like opening up any other store. So I think by the time that a retailer has gone through all of their, diligence and, state requirements to say, I want to locate here, then we say, no, we've kind of decided that the residents don't want you to be here.
But we know that from our residents, first of all, I agree with you, Senta, that, we don't have residents engaged in this discussion right now. We had our committee the whole meeting, and we had no residents came to speak, which is okay. And we might do some outreach even as we talk about Eden's Plaza. But I think our experience on the board knows that when we're going to hear from residents is when the first special use permit comes in. That's just our process. That's when we're going to hear feedback. And so that's why I'm saying, that the outreach will help us understand where residents really are.
But I think, Kathy, that when we do narrow this down to, say, a location, at that point, well before a special use, that we invite folks in, whether it's 250 feet or some other distance, to say, to tell them that this is being considered. And I think at that point, we will get, I would think, some significant engagement. Well before it, somebody's actually going to the zoning board.
And I don't fully understand the process, obviously, of a cannabis retailer, but, if we approve an area, if we approve a district and we approve, like, I assume we can kind of choose a range of size and we can make other rules and regulations about what we want. If we've done all that, and they come in for a special use at that particular location, meeting, the parameters that we laid out, can we then, we can, but, at that point, is that fair to say no, because now, the community doesn't want it here? Like I said, I feel like this is a different process than just opening up a different, than opening up a retail store of some other kind. That we really need to, but I don't know that process. So, that's kind of a question for staff as well, as to, how set do we have to be by the time we come up, if we do pick a location.
So I guess part of the conversation is we have to start somewhere, right? So we have to start with a particular zoning district that we want to look at. If we want to even allow the retail sale of cannabis, we don't necessarily have to. And each of those zoning districts or district that we come up with will probably have their own set of regulations based upon some recommendations made from me and from staff and from the feelings of the committee, because Eden's Plaza is sort of in a way an island, whereas Plaza del Lago is not. Do we have to have certain distancing restrictions? Do we have to have size restrictions as to, what size of a retail establishment we would allow in Plaza del Lago? Is that different? And the other thing is, a lot of this could come up, a lot of that could be just left open-ended, like a lot of other uses are, almost every other use is. We don't necessarily say you can have this size restaurant or that size restaurant. We do some of that in our downtown districts where certain square footage triggers a special use. But that's the purpose of a special use at that point. And even in Eden's Plaza itself, if a dispensary were to go in the middle of Eden's Plaza next to the old Carson's building by the Starbucks, that's a different criteria or a different set of regulations that you may want to impose versus one that did an outlet or a new outlet on the corner. There's traffic and parking considerations that are much different. There's operational considerations that would be much different. So we're kind of almost putting the cart before the horse here with the regulations, because we need to know what districts to look at. And those regulations that we put forth are the baseline. The special use then is additional regulations on top that where you have all these considerations now for the site, this very specific use at a very specific site. I hope that answers the question and the process.
Right. I think part of it is just trying to understand the regulatory process that these cannabis retailers have to go through with the state, and, in their decision-making process, which I'm not really familiar with. I hear some things about, it's difficult to get a license and, so-and-so, but I don't really know what they're going through at the point where they are at the point when they say, I'd like to locate here.
So it's not like a liquor license, right, where in the sense that the state is open-ended on how many liquor licenses they can give. There is a cap of the number of licenses that are going to be allowed. It's capped at no more than 500, but it doesn't have to go up to 500. So yes, and that's statewide. So there is a competitive issue here where some licenses are just not going to be given to people that want to open up a dispensary because they're not going to allow it. The process by which they go through to open up a particular site is similar to a liquor license, where they have to come to the village first. They have to get the local approval first. And that's not only do we allow it under zoning, but they've gotten a special use permit from us if that's what we want to require, and they can meet all the conditions that we put forth on that special use, parking, operations inside, other things, distances that we want to put in there. And once they certify that, or once we certify that to the state, then they can go ahead and actually ask the state for a license. That does not mean they get it from the state. So again, all of this could be, we're just opening up the door for them, but it could end up with nothing, or it could end up with a successful or even a non-successful dispensary. But it all depends on, essentially, there's a lot of different levels of regulation here, but we are the first stop, and they have to get over our hurdle first before they go anywhere else.
Is there like a time limit on that? I mean, what if we did go through this and we granted a special use and they couldn't get a license from the state? I assume that they can apply every year. Can we put some kind of a deadline on it? Because, I mean, we obviously wouldn't want to keep that open.
Yeah, our special use is limited to a year anyway, right? We would limit it to say that, if you don't begin construction, if you don't get your licensing. The other thing is we can condition it. We can condition that special use to say, if you don't apply to the state within 3 months, if you don't get some approval with the state within 12 months, then the special use has lapsed, and you can then come back and we can say yes, or we can say no as a new application. So it's similar to building permits. We don't want them opening and laying out there for 3 years anyway. We want these things to kind of move along or move on, right? So that we could absolutely do that, and we should probably do that.
So, committee members, where are we on this? Do we have to make a decision tonight as to the not recommended and recommended?
I say we get, I think Kathy has talked to a representative. I talked to a representative. I know staff has talked to a representative. I think at our next meeting, it would be great to have, a representative. I mean, if we start focusing on Eden's Plaza, forgive me for all of you. I'm going to have another million questions on Eden's Plaza. So, I'm kind of holding back on that because I have questions coming on that as well. But I think I would, I'd like a professional consensus here. Is it even worth it for us to discuss other locations? I mean, it's ultimately our decision and we base it on what the community wants. But, is there something that we would agree upon, representatives or whatever speaking in front of us, and then we'd say, okay, well, now we're really just discussing one location.
So that's a decision-making process that doesn't occur tonight. That would be following our next meeting.
Well, let me ask a question. I mean, if we decide that we're going to proceed with just Eden's Plaza, what's our next meeting going to entail? I mean, does it really make a difference? I mean, I think we're agreeing, we're only talking about one other location. So we're trying to get, from my perspective, we're trying to give staff some perspective, some direction on what sites we might even consider, right? And so I think we have already ruled out the neighborhood retail business districts, NR1, GC1, GC2, Village Center, right? Office research, PCD3. So so right now, so my question is it that much? I don't know what our next meeting is. What is the issue with keeping right now Plaza del Lago on the table versus taking it off? I don't understand why. I guess that's what I'm asking.
All right, if I could jump in here, I think kind of respond to both Trustee Plunkett and Trustee Dodd. In terms of Trustee Plunkett and your suggestion in terms of inviting an industry rep, I think I would take the opposite position of that, because I think we want to make sure that we're zoning not based on, an industry's specific desires of where they want to be, but where our community wants them to be and needs them to be. So, if the industry says they want to be at Eden's Plaza, that's the only place. But in our process and our discussions, we're not comfortable with Eden's Plaza, then we still say no to Eden's Plaza, even if the industry wants to be there. So I think we want to keep the focus on what's right for Wilmette. And then if it's right for a dispensary, great. If it's not right for a dispensary, I think we've all gotten to the point where that's okay too. The referendum.
Sorry, can I chime in really quick?
Yeah.
Is that, if I'm the attorney for the industry rep or if I'm presenting, I'm going to tell you every district is great because I want options, and I'm not going to sit there and limit myself because it costs me nothing. So I think to Mike's point is well taken, that we wouldn't necessarily make a zoning decision on whether we want to put a restaurant somewhere or not, right? Based upon what the restaurant's desire is, because they would want to go there. They'd want the option at least to go there. So I think that Mike's point is well taken on that, because the industry is going to say, this is the best place for it. And if I had to choose, this is the one place, but I would, zone it everywhere. So I have all these choices. That would be great. So I think we got to be careful with that a little bit, as to Mike's point.
So that's one point. No, thank you, Jeff. That was helpful. And then on to Trustee Dodd's question, what does the next meeting look like? And that's a really good question. And I think, if we do make the decision tonight that we're narrowing this down to 1 or 2 locations, then I think we would have the follow-up discussion this evening of what do we want to see at that next meeting? What's the information we want? So, for example, at Eden's Plaza, I think we'd want to invite Newport Capital, who's the owner of the plaza. I think we'd want to see if we can bring in a retail broker, if not the current broker for the site, who's trying to fill vacancies, somebody who has a lot of experience in the area who could speak to, what a dispensary's impact is on other national retailers. The retail coach, that's a firm we've engaged to help us with Eden's Plaza. They do work in Colorado, which obviously has a lot of experience with retail dispensaries. If they can't attend the meeting, I think we can get some type of opinion or discussion from them as well. We're going to want to have Loyola there to provide their feedback. And as Trustee Barrow had hinted at earlier, I think we should look at some type of radius. I think, John Adler, correct me if I'm wrong, when we do a variation or special use, is it 250 feet or 500 feet from the property line, where we mail out 250?
Yes.
Where we would mail out notices to all those properties and let them know, the land use committee of the village board is having this discussion to consider whether this is an appropriate location. We want your feedback. Please attend that meeting. Please provide us comments in advance. And it really is kind of a research or a data collection meeting to learn more about the impacts on a site, ask a lot of questions, and then, if the committee is comfortable or not comfortable based on that discussion, you can make a recommendation to the board, or we could have another meeting for follow-up.
So I know Peter and I weren't comfortable with Plaza del Lago, but we also said we're not voting. So I don't know, that ultimately this is for the entire village board to vote on. So I don't know that, and tell me, I don't know that the two of us can say, well, I don't think that's a great location. I mean, is that something that we keep discussing, or, is that too difficult at the next meeting to discuss such, varied locations? But I mean, we're not voting on this, so
I good question, and 2 points. And I'd be a little hesitant to talk about both at the same meeting. I think we're going to get significant public feedback from Plaza del Lago, and I think that's a standalone meeting, and we should be prepared for that feedback. So I think that would have to be separated. This committee is just filing a report and making a recommendation. If it comes to the board that Plaza del Lago was not recommended, the board could send this back to committee if they think it requires further research and further public feedback, or the board can discuss it amongst all 7 members. So you're never shutting the door on it, but you're focusing the conversation.
So it seems like what I think, because it's our role to provide as much information as possible to the village board, correct? So it seems like what we should do, I would say, why don't we proceed with our next meeting with Eden's Plaza? Because you said, that in and of itself is going to bring up a lot of questions. We might learn from that discussion that we don't want to proceed with Plaza del Lago. Second, we could have another meeting on Plaza del Lago. And if all these residents show up as we expect, then we have the information we need to give to the board, which is the reason why we didn't proceed any further with Plaza del Lago was because the residents showed up and weren't happy with it.
So just one thought on the Plaza del Lago and on the residents. So we all, we're talking, about generally those condos on, on Sheridan Road. We've got an older demographic and we're all on Zoom now. And I would just, you know, or even in person, you know, we're in COVID, but all meetings are on Zoom. It is a little bit harder to engage residents and get their feedback. And especially, you know, I wonder, I just want to make sure that we're not, you know, saying, oh, residents didn't respond because they are not necessarily, you know, tech savvy or, you know, able to jump into some of these meetings. So it's just a consideration with, you know, the demographics that we're discussing in that area.
Yeah, I'm comfortable proceeding with Eden's Plaza as our first priority. I just would like us not to rule out Plaza del Lago in its entirety. So.
Trustee Dodd, just for a procedural point of view, is that you're not closing the door on this thing permanently in any way. The zoning code can change a year from now, 5 years from now, 10 days from now. If it turns out that the decision that we went through isn't the correct one, or there's a shift in policy, or there's a shift in perception, this can always be revisited. What I think is, so I don't want you to think that we're ever
I
closing
know,
the door.
but this is
Never-
when we're
you never
trying to
close the
engage
door.
the community. But this is when we're trying to engage the community on this topic. So if we think it's one, I mean, I agree we could come back in a year. We can always come back. But this is when hopefully staff and all of us are, you know, engaging the community that we're looking at this. And so we need to decide whether we're, you know, how we're proceeding. That's all.
And I think that's a fair point, but what I want to make sure you understand, that everybody understands that's watching, is that the door's never
Yes.
permanently closed. And, you know, you would need another public hearing, so that you would still have to engage the community if you wanted to add or take away. You need to go through another public hearing process
Okay.
where notice is given, like Mr. Adler described.
So I would say that the approach that Mike described before I disappeared from your screens was exactly the one that I would suggest that we follow. This decision should not be driven by the industry. It shouldn't be a function of where they think it's a great place or not a great place. We should determine what we think as Wilmette trustees is the best location for our residents, and that fits various criteria. I think the 4 that we've been looking at are very good. Perhaps there are others, but I think these 4 are very good. And if it turns out that upon applying these criteria, the only place is Plaza del Lago, and the industry then says, oh no, we don't want to be in Plaza del Lago, then I would be very comfortable saying to our residents, I don't favor retail sale of cannabis in Wilmette. No one in Wilmette will be deprived of cannabis when they can go to the greenhouse right across from Old Orchard. So I think what's correct for the residents ought to be our primary consideration. And if that works well for the industry, that might be terrific. And if it's not, then you know what? Wilmette's not the place to sell cannabis. I'm perfectly comfortable with that.
Good. So I agree, Peter. And I think that just if people are watching or if they understand, you know, this meeting here, we are not choosing a location to establish retail cannabis. We are discussing locations, and you're right. In the end, we may not agree on any location. That is still obviously an option on the table. We are not trying to narrow it down to the one location where we're going to allow it. We haven't decided that yet. So I just want to make that clear that, you know, that is not a done deal either.
And I think Trustee Plunkett, to that point, we'll be very clear, you know, in our communications to the public and in our outreach that point. That I think that's really important. That if we select 1 or 2 or 3 locations to focus on, that's just for more study and more research.
Okay, anything further from the trustees?
Are we going through questions that we want to have answered at our next meeting? Because I know we talked about a few. So,
absolutely.
okay,
Yeah.
so yes, Newport, yes, retail coach, and any real estate person coming, yes, Loyola, yes, a radius, and maybe a little bit more information about sizes of these stores, and what that would mean if we were talking about East Plaza. And then also, if there are any, regulations, any national retailers that have in their leases that they will not be near a recreational cannabis. I believe Newport doesn't have an issue with its mortgage, but I think if you have a federally backed mortgage, you are not allowed to have a retail cannabis store on your premises. So I just kind of want to, touch all the possible bases here in terms of, and also I want to know about, what they're thinking about for Eden's Plaza. We want to discuss the future of Eden's Plaza, without the cannabis store driving that. That's even if we did get a cannabis store, that's hopefully just going to be a small portion of Eden's Plaza. So let's discuss, where we see the future of Eden's Plaza going and what kind of retail we want for that location.
Yeah, I agree. All good thoughts. And certainly the Newport folks thinking about all of the things that you have spoken about vis-a-vis an owner of the property and a borrower. I did a fair amount of shopping center lending when I was still practicing. I don't recall what the loan covenant said. They probably said something, but it's certainly worth exploring.
We will make sure to have as many of those answers as we can in advance or at the meeting. And obviously, if the committee has additional questions that I'm sure will come up, please share them with us in advance. And we'll also solicit questions from the community as well. There may be other questions out there that we haven't thought of that we can try to answer. So just to make sure that we're clear as we're planning moving forward, we're going to focus the next discussion squarely on Eden's Plaza. We're not necessarily shutting the door on Plaza del Lago, but that's not the primary focus now, and we can revisit that discussion after we dig into Eden's Plaza more. Is that a fair summary of where we're at?
Yeah, I'm fine with that, Mike.
That's fair. I think Eden's Plaza is going to take up a whole meeting anyway, so I think it's best to use that time efficiently and focus on that.
Okay. Anything else, trustees? No? Good. Seeing none. All right, let's turn to the public comment portion of this meeting as regards cannabis. And as I mentioned earlier, individuals are allotted up to 3 minutes to comment. This meeting is being conducted remotely, so I will ask people who are watching on YouTube Live submit comments for the staff to read. While they were typing, I will ask if there are any individuals who have connected to the meeting via Microsoft Teams or the telephone who would like to address the committee. As I said earlier, I would first ask you to identify yourself, and then we would go back and call on people. If there's anyone who would like to address the committee, please let us know your name, and we will compile the list. Alex, have we received any YouTube comments?
No, there are currently no comments on YouTube.
No comments. And can we tell if anyone has connected to us with Teams, if there's such, or on the telephone that would like to make a comment to us?
Those individuals would have to unmute themselves. I do not see anybody unmuted at this time.
Okay. Well, then the next item of business on the agenda is item number 5, new business. Is there any new business from the committee itself? Trustees? No? Hearing none, I'll move to item 6, which is public comment for items on the agenda. As a reminder, individuals are allowed up to 3 minutes to comment on an item that's not on the agenda. This meeting is being conducted remotely, so I ask people who are watching on YouTube Live to submit comments for the staff to read while they were typing. I will ask if there are any individuals who have connected to the meeting via Microsoft Teams or the telephone that would like to address the committee. As I said earlier, you have to first identify yourself, and then we will go back and call on people. If there's anyone who would like to address the committee, please unmute yourself and let us know your name, and we will compile a list. Once again, Alex, have we received any comments on YouTube Live?
Still no comments on YouTube Live.
Comments, thank you. And I assume no comments from anyone who has unmuted themselves. So we are done then with the new business item. Item 7 on the agenda is adjournment. Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
And a second?
Second.
Thank you. Having been made and second, Eric, would you please call the roll?
Trustee Plunkett,
Aye.
Trustee Dodd,
Aye.
and Trustee Barrow.
Aye. We now stand adjourned, and I thank you all, trustees and staff. This has been a really interesting discussion. I think we have moved this really complicated question along. We've got a lot more to do, and I look forward to speaking with all of you and doing so. So thank